Tonight, let's settle in and spend some time with the history of America's lesbian bars. Welcome back to Queer History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time together, exploring another corner of LGBTQ plus history. Before we begin, if you enjoy cozy bedtime stories and LGBTQ plus history, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe. And if you enjoyed tonight's story, I'll be back tomorrow night with the next episode in this series. Every episode on this channel is carefully researched, and you'll find the full source list for tonight's episode in the description below. Now, get comfortable, and let's begin. There is a particular kind of door that appears over and over again in the history of lesbian bars. It's usually nothing special. Painted wood, maybe. A handle worn smooth from years of use. Sometimes there's no sign at all, just a number above the frame, or a small card tucked somewhere unobtrusive. From the outside, the building looks like almost anything else. A row house, a converted storefront, a basement entrance on a street corner where people walk by every day without ever looking twice. But behind that door, something else entirely is happening. Music, laughter, the sound of voices filling a low-ceilinged room, the soft clunk of a bottle being set down on a bar top, women dancing together, slowly, in a space that belongs to them, that has always belonged to them, even though the world outside those walls would prefer they had no such place at all. This is the story of those doors, and of the women who found them, who needed them, who built them, who fought to keep them open, and who now, in our own time, are working hard to make sure a few of them remain. It's a long story, and it's a quiet one, mostly. Not the kind of history that makes the front pages. Not the kind that gets monuments or parades or school curricula. At least, not often. It's the history of women who gathered in the dark, who pressed close together on small dance floors, who whispered warnings when a police car pulled up outside, who invented their own rituals and languages and dress codes and social customs because nobody else was going to do it for them. It's a history of survival, and of joy, and of community built in the most unlikely of places, borrowed basements and back rooms and neighborhood dive bars on the wrong side of gentrification. So let's start at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can get, because the beginning is harder to pin down than you might think. Let's go back, way back, before the neon signs, and the softball leagues, and the political book racks, and the film crews, before there was anything that could be called, by any reasonable definition, a lesbian bar. Let's go back to a time when women who loved women had almost no public space at all. If you try to imagine the 19th century, it helps to think not just about what was there, but about what was missing. There was no word, at least not in common usage, for what we would now call a lesbian. The vocabulary hadn't been built yet. The social category was still taking shape, slowly, in the writings of early sexologists, like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs and Richard von Krafft-Ebing, men who were trying to classify and name and categorize what they observed, though not always in ways that were kind or accurate or welcome to the people being described. What existed, instead, was a landscape of very careful navigation. Women who were drawn to other women had to find each other without any map, without any guide, without any institution that acknowledged their existence or their desires. And yet they did find each other. They always did. In the cities, the options were limited and often dangerous. The laws of the 19th century, and well into the 20th, were not designed to protect women who stepped outside the narrow path of heterosexual respectability. A woman out alone at night, unaccompanied by a male relative or guardian, could be stopped, questioned, arrested. Vice laws, the broad, flexible category of legislation that governed public morality, could be applied almost anywhere, to almost anyone, at almost any time. Women who frequented certain establishments, who dressed in certain ways, who kept certain company, could find themselves labelled as prostitutes and treated accordingly. The law, as it was written and enforced, assumed that a respectable woman was a woman embedded in domestic life, married or seeking marriage, or in the safe custody of her family. Any deviation from that model invited suspicion. Any gathering of women outside the domestic sphere was, by definition, legible to authorities as potentially disreputable. And so, the gathering had to happen somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere hidden. The apartment party was the oldest solution. It's simple, when you think about it. You don't need a license. You don't need a landlord's permission, at least not officially. You don't need to worry about a bartender who might refuse to serve you, or a bouncer who might turn you away at the door, or a policeman who might be watching from a car parked across the street. You need a room. You need your friends. You need music, somehow, a piano, a phonograph, whatever was available, and you need the willingness to keep it quiet enough that the neighbours don't complain. These apartment parties were the foundational social infrastructure of women who loved women for decades. They were not glamorous, necessarily. They were not the kind of venue that gets remembered in history books or commemorated with blue plaques. They were private by necessity, and because they were private, almost no record survives of most of them. We know they happened primarily through memoirs, letters, police records, and the occasional newspaper story that described them in the most lurid and disapproving terms possible. But they happened, regularly, consistently, across cities throughout the country. Women gathered in each other's homes, and they danced and they laughed and they found each other, and they built something, even if it couldn't last past the next morning. An apartment party required someone willing to host, which meant someone with a certain amount of stability, a reliable place to live, some degree of social credibility in her building or her neighbourhood. It required networks of trust, systems for letting the right people know where and when, while keeping that information away from anyone who might cause trouble. It required, in other words, a community that already existed to some degree, even if it was fragile and informal and constantly at risk. Community, once you have it, generates more community. Word spreads. Women who attended one apartment party met women who could invite them to the next one. Slowly, cautiously, a social world assembled itself out of these individual private gatherings, linked together by the invisible threads of mutual recognition and shared need. The lesbian bar, when it eventually appeared, didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew out of this earlier, quieter, more hidden tradition. It was the apartment party made public, or as public as it could manage to be. The door that was previously in someone's home moved, eventually, to the street. But the impulse behind it, the fundamental human need to gather with your own people, to be known and recognized and not alone, that had been there all along. The early 20th century brought changes that would eventually make a more visible social world possible. But those changes were slow and uneven, and Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s was many things. It was the center of one of the great cultural renaissances in American history. It was the home of poets and painters and musicians who were reshaping what American culture could be. It was also, during the years of Prohibition, a destination. If you wanted to drink, legally, after 1920, you couldn't, and so you had to go somewhere that the rules were applied loosely. Harlem was the place. The clubs and speakeasies that flourished there during Prohibition operated in a complicated social ecosystem. White New Yorkers came uptown to experience what they called, with a mixture of fascination and condescension, the exotic. Black entrepreneurs and business owners recognized an opportunity and built establishments that catered to this crossover crowd. And within that already complicated scene, something else was happening too. Harlem developed what historians have called queer districts, neighborhoods and blocks where same-sex socializing was permitted, or at least tolerated, in ways that it simply wasn't elsewhere in the city. Part of what made this possible was a specific geography of policing. The officers assigned to patrol black neighborhoods during this era were often more focused on controlling vice in ways that served their own interests. Accepting bribes, extracting money and compliance from business owners, than they were in applying the law consistently. The result was an environment where certain kinds of behavior that would have brought immediate arrest in a white neighborhood could, if you knew the right people and paid the right prices, proceed without too much interference. The relative freedom of Harlem's queer districts was built, at least in part, on the exploitation and corruption that defined policing in black neighborhoods of that era. The tolerance was never really about tolerance at all. It was about economics and power, and the willingness of those in authority to look the other way when it suited them to do so. But within those very constrained and complicated circumstances, something real was being built. The blues singers who performed in Harlem's clubs during this era, women like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and Gladys Bentley, were performing to audiences that understood, if they wanted to, what was being sung about. The imagery of the blues, its coded language of same-sex desire, its celebration of women who didn't fit the domestic mold. All of this circulated through Harlem's entertainment world with a freedom that was remarkable for its time. Gladys Bentley, in particular, deserves a moment here. She was a black lesbian performer who performed in a white tuxedo and top hat, who openly sang about her love for women, who was married in a widely reported ceremony to another woman in 1931. She played regularly at clubs like the Clam House, where her act was a fixture of the Harlem nightlife circuit. She was celebrated and famous, and, by the standards of the 1920s, almost impossibly visible about who she was. The Harlem Renaissance created a space, however temporary and imperfect, where certain kinds of queer expression could exist in the open. Rent parties, those apartment gatherings we talked about earlier, but thrown for a specific purpose, to collect money for rent, were a staple of Harlem life, and many of them were explicitly or implicitly spaces where same-sex couples could dance together, where gender could be performed in creative and non-conforming ways, where the rules that governed the rest of the city felt a little less absolute. The experience of black and white women in this period was not the same. not remotely. White women who wanted to participate in the social world of Harlem could take the train uptown and move through those spaces with relative ease. They were visitors, slumming it, as the phrase went, which is a terrible way to describe what they were doing, but it captures the dynamic. They could step into Harlem's queer world and step out again, returning to their own neighborhoods with their anonymity intact. The visit was an adventure. The risk was bounded. Black women had no such option. If you lived in Harlem, your social world was under constant observation by neighbors, family members, the church, the community networks that held Black social life together under enormous pressure. A Black woman seen at a rent party that was known to be frequented by women who liked women could not simply disappear back into her own private life. The consequences of exposure, family rejection, community censure, professional damage, were immediate and close. And so for Black women, the apartment party remained even more essential, even more carefully managed, even more dependent on those networks of the Second World War. It's hard to overstate how fundamentally this period altered the social landscape for women in America. And not just in America. Across the industrialized world, the war reshuffled the deck in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The simplest version is this. Men left. Millions of them, mobilized into the armed forces, shipped overseas, gone. And the work they had done, in factories, in offices, in industries of every kind, still needed to be done. So women did it. Between 1940 and 1945, the female workforce in the United States expanded enormously. Women who had been expected to remain in the home entered paid employment in vast numbers. They built ships. They assembled aircraft. They worked in chemical plants and munitions factories and steel mills. They drove vehicles, operated heavy machinery, managed supply chains. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter captured something real about this moment. The sense that the domestic ideal of femininity had been, at least temporarily, suspended by necessity. But the war did something else too. It moved people. Young women who had grown up in small towns, in rural areas, in places where everyone knew everyone, and your whole life was visible to the community around you. Those women found themselves, suddenly, in cities. Military bases were surrounded by urban areas. Industrial centers attracted workers from all over the country. For many women, the war years were the first time in their lives that they had the experience of relative anonymity, of being somewhere where their history and their family and their reputation didn't follow them everywhere they went. If you had grown up feeling different, feeling drawn to other women, feeling like something about you didn't fit the script you'd been handed, and if you had spent your whole life navigating that feeling in a place where you were known and watched and embedded in a community that expected certain things from you, then moving to a city for the war was something more than just a change of address. It was the possibility of being someone else, or more precisely, of being yourself, in public for the first time. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WAAC, was its own separate world. Thousands of women served, living in close quarters, working and training and eating and sleeping alongside other women day after day, removed from the domestic structures that had previously organized their lives. The same-sex bonds that formed in this environment were intense and, for many women, revelatory. Not all of them were romantic or erotic, obviously, but some were. and for a woman who had never had language for what she felt, or had been afraid to act on it, or had simply never met another woman who felt the same way, the experience of the WAAC could be genuinely transformative. This is the context in which, slowly, something new begins to appear in American cities. Not yet, quite, the lesbian bar as we would recognize it, but something moving in that direction. Women-only social spaces, or spaces where women could gather without the usual social chaperonage, without the implied obligation of heterosexual pairing, without the constant presence of men who expected certain things. After the war ended, the conventional narrative says that women went home, and many of them did. The propaganda of the late 1940s was unambiguous about what was expected. The men had returned. The factories needed to make refrigerators instead of tanks, and women were supposed to redirect themselves back into the domestic sphere with enthusiasm. The baby boom was, among other things, a demonstration of how many people complied with this expectation. But not everyone went home. Not entirely. And some of those who went back to their hometowns found that they couldn't stay, that they had changed too much, seen too much, experienced too much. Some of them found their way back to the cities, found each other again, and began looking for somewhere to go. The post-war years, particularly the late 1940s and the 1950s, are when we start to see lesbian bars emerge as a recognizable institution. Not everywhere, not openly, not without enormous risk, but in certain cities, in certain neighborhoods, in the kinds of places that didn't attract too much police attention, women were beginning to gather in commercial spaces, in bars, in the public world. The conditions were still terrifying, really. The 1950s were, in many ways, a deeply hostile period for anyone outside the mainstream of heterosexual domestic life. The Red Scare and the Lavender Scare ran together. The government purged suspected homosexuals from federal employment on the theory that they were vulnerable to blackmail by the Soviets. And let's imagine an evening. It's somewhere in the mid-1950s. A city, it doesn't matter which one, though San Francisco, and New York, and Chicago, and Detroit, and dozens of other cities all had their versions of this. It's getting dark. You've spent the day at whatever job you have. Secretary, lab technician, waitress, factory worker, nurse. You've been careful all day, the way you're always careful. Careful about what you say, careful about how you look, careful about who you look at, for too long. The effort of that carefulness is something you carry like a weight, so familiar by now that you barely notice it anymore. But tonight, you have somewhere to go. You might take a bus, or walk, or if you have a car, you might park it a block or two away. Not right in front. Not if you're being careful. And you're always being careful. The bar doesn't advertise. There might be a sign, but it won't say much. Probably just a name. Something ordinary sounding. Nothing that would catch the eye of someone who wasn't looking for it. You push open the door and step inside. The first thing you notice is the sound. Music. Probably from a jukebox, because live music is expensive and draws attention. But a jukebox can be loaded with the right songs. Songs that feel like something, even if they don't say anything directly. Women's voices, country, or blues, or early rock and roll, filling the room with something warmer than silence. The second thing is the light, or the relative lack of it. These places are almost always dim, partly because dim is cozy and forgiving, but partly because darkness is practical. It makes it harder for someone peering in from outside to see exactly what's happening. What are you doing in there, officer? Just having a drink. Look how dark it is. You can barely see anything. And then you start to take in the room itself. The bar along one wall, with stools along it. Maybe some booths or tables toward the back. If there's a dance floor, it's small. A cleared space, really, not purpose-built, just enough room for a few couples to move together. The walls might be bare, or they might have things hung on them. Mirrors, maybe, or just whatever the owner put up years ago and never thought to change. And there are women. Everywhere you look, women. Talking, laughing, drinking, leaning close together over a table, sitting at the bar with a beer, and watching the room. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, because this is the 1950s, and everyone smokes everywhere. The whole place has a slightly hazy quality, blurred at the edges, which maybe makes it feel a little dreamlike. You're here. You made it. The reality of the mid-century lesbian bar was also complicated in ways that deserve attention, though. It was not all warmth and community and dancing freely. There were rules. There were hierarchies. There were social codes that could be just as rigid in their own way as the ones you'd left outside. The most visible of those codes was what we now call butch femme culture. In the bars of the 1940s and 1950s, the dominant social vocabulary was organised around this pairing. Butch women, who dressed in masculine styles, who presented themselves in ways that moved toward the masculine end of the gender spectrum, and femme women, who dressed and presented in more conventionally feminine ways, organised their social identities and their relationships around this binary. It was not simply a fashion choice. It was a system, a way of navigating a world that had no map for women who loved women. The butch-femme dynamic offered a recognizable structure, a way of signaling identity to other women who could read the code, while remaining at least partially invisible to outsiders who didn't know what to look for. It was a way of insisting on identity, of saying, without saying anything, I am this kind of person. I am here. I am not going away. The butch role was often the more dangerous one. A woman who wore men's clothing, who kept her hair cut short, who moved through the world in a way that was visibly non-conforming. She was the most legible to hostile observers, the most likely to attract the wrong kind of attention. In some jurisdictions, there were actual laws, often referred to as the three-piece rule, that required a person to be wearing at least 3 items of clothing considered appropriate to their assigned sex. Violating this could result in arrest. The femme, by contrast, could sometimes move through straight spaces with relative invisibility. A woman in a dress and heels, with her hair done, the hostile gaze might not identify her as queer at all. But that invisibility came with its own complications, its own erasures. Inside the bar community, femmes sometimes had to work to assert that. The police relationship to the lesbian bar in mid-20th century America was one of the defining features of this social world. And it was not simply a matter of raids, though raids happened and they were terrifying. The relationship was more complex and more pervasive than that. Think about what it meant to run a bar in this era. Your business depended on your liquor license, and your liquor license could be revoked at any time, for any reason, at the discretion of the relevant authorities. if your establishment was deemed immoral or was found to be serving homosexuals. The law, as written and interpreted, gave police and liquor control boards enormous power over the commercial spaces where queer women gathered. Bar owners were in an almost impossible position. They needed their customers. They were running a business after all. But having those customers was itself grounds for the state to shut them down. The result was a whole ecosystem of informal negotiation, of payoffs and arrangements and carefully maintained relationships with individual officers, of strategic compliance and creative evasion. Some bars paid bribes. Some cultivated relationships with particular officers who were willing to look the other way in exchange for money or favors. Some tried to maintain a careful balance, allowing queer women to gather, but enforcing rules about physical contact and visible same-sex affection that might make the place look, to a casual observer, like any other bar. At a bar called Peg's Place in San Francisco, the need for surveillance was architecturally embedded. The venue had an interior-facing window, a window that looked from somewhere, presumably where the DJ worked, directly onto the dance floor. Through that window, the DJ watched what was happening, watching for touching, watching for any physical contact that might, if observed by police, constitute evidence of immoral behavior. Patrons described this as prison-style socializing, which is a phrase that should stop us for a moment, because it's so stark. People went to this bar, went out of their homes, traveled there, paid for drinks, tried to have an evening of pleasure and community, and the environment was one that they compared to prison. The watching, the enforced distance, the constant awareness of being monitored. For many women, this was the only option they had. Peg's Place also had a ban on blue jeans. This might sound trivial, but it wasn't. The ban was strategic, about managing how the bar looked to outside observers, to police, to neighbors, to anyone who might decide to make trouble. Blue jeans in the 1950s were associated with working-class masculinity, with the kinds of women who were most visibly queer, most legible as outside the boundaries of respectable femininity. Banning blue jeans was a way of enforcing a kind of surface respectability, a middle-class aesthetic that might, the thinking went, be slightly more protection against police attention. Historians call this respectability politics, the strategy of performing conformity with mainstream social expectations in order to minimize the violence directed at you for being who you are. It's a survival strategy, and understandable as such. But it was, as the women who experienced it would have been the first to tell you, deeply uncomfortable. Because to protect yourself, you have to partially conform to the very standards being used to oppress you. You have to look a certain way, behave a certain way, signal a certain kind of class status in order to be deemed acceptable enough to be left alone. And of course, it didn't always work. At Maud's, the bar in San Francisco that would become one of the most beloved institutions in the city's queer community, the police tactics were different, but equally oppressive. Tactical squad cop cars would park outside the bar. Just park there, visible to anyone going in or coming out. The message was clear. We know what this place is. We're watching. Anyone who walks through that door should know that we're taking note. The effect of this was chilling. For women who had jobs that could be lost if their employers found out they were gay, and in that era, that was most jobs, the sight of a police car outside the bar was enough to make you turn around and walk the other way. For women whose families didn't know, whose landlords didn't know, whose neighbours didn't know. The possibility that your name or face might end up in a police report was genuinely terrifying. The tactical squad cars were not there to enforce any specific law necessarily. They were there to intimidate, to remind everyone present that they existed at the sufferance of the state, and that the state was not forgetting about them. Inside, imagine Maud's on a weekday evening in, let's say, 1968. The bar was founded by a woman named Ricky Streicher in 1966, and it would go on to become one of the most significant lesbian institutions in San Francisco's history. But in 1968, it's still relatively young, still finding its shape. The clientele at Maud's was famously diverse, in class terms, in occupation terms, in the way women styled themselves. The bar sat at a particular crossroads moment. The homophile generation, the women who had been part of organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis, who had come up in the culture of the 1950s, who had navigated the bars and the police harassment and the respectability politics of that era. They were still coming in, and alongside them, increasingly, were younger women who had been shaped by the countercultural explosion of the 1960s. The Haight-Ashbury hippie scene was just across the city, and its influence was visible in the changing aesthetics of the women who came through Maud's door. The butch-femme dynamic that had organized the social world of lesbian bars through the 1940s and 1950s was being challenged. Young women arriving from the hippie scene often presented in a more androgynous way. Flowing hair, natural looks, the soft edges of what you might call hippie dyke style. That didn't fit neatly into the butch-femme binary. This created friction. Women who had organized their whole identities and social relationships around the butch-femme system sometimes found the new style confusing or threatening, something that seemed to be erasing a culture they had built at great cost. The Daughters of Bilitis, the first lesbian political organization in the United States, founded in 1955, had its own complicated relationship to all of this. Their newsletter had, in an earlier era, published guidance that was explicitly shaped by respectability politics. The language was stark. Women who wore fly front pants and butch haircuts were described as the worst publicity we can get. The concern was real. The organization was trying to argue for the humanity and social acceptability of lesbians, and they believed that visible gender nonconformity made that argument harder to make to a skeptical straight public. But the effect of that language was to reinforce class divisions within the community, to tell working-class butch women that their way of being was a liability. This tension between visibility and respectability, between pride and strategic concealment, ran through the bars of this era like a fault line. It hadn't been resolved by 1968. It wouldn't be resolved for a long time. In some ways, the arguments it represents are still happening today. Back inside the bar, the jukebox is playing. Someone has chosen a slow song. A couple moves together on the small dance floor, close enough that their bodies are nearly touching. Or maybe touching, if the bar is one that's managed to create enough safety and privacy that this is possible. The light is low. The cigarette smoke is thick. The beer is cold. There's a conversation happening at the bar. Two women who have been coming here for years, who know each other's whole histories by now, whose friendship was built in this space over hundreds of evenings, just like this one. And there's a woman in the corner who is here for the first time, who is trying not to look as nervous as she feels, who arrived knowing that this was a lesbian bar, and who is still adjusting to the reality of it, to the fact that this is a real place, that she actually found it, that there are other women here who are like her. That moment, the first time, is one that gets described over and over again in the oral histories and memoirs that document this world. The shock of recognition, the relief, the feeling of coming out of a long isolation into something warm. Women who found lesbian bars for the first time in the 1950s and 1960s often described it as the most important moment of their lives, not always in terms of romance or sex, sometimes simply in terms of not being alone anymore, of discovering that there were others. That is what the bar was, at its core. A place where you could discover that there were others. And then the lights flickered. Let's cross the Atlantic for a moment, because there's a story in London that belongs in this telling. At 239 King's Road in Chelsea, which was, in the 1960s, one of the most fashionable addresses in the city, the centre of swinging London, the street where Mary Quant had her boutique, and young people came to be seen in their miniskirts and bell-bottoms. There was a door, a green door, an unremarkable green door, set into a building that looked like almost anything else on the block. Behind that green door was the Gateways Club. The Gateways was London's longest-running lesbian venue. It had been operating since the late 1930s, had survived the Blitz, had survived post-war austerity, had survived decade after decade of social change. By the 1960s, it was something of an institution, not widely known outside the community, but within it, absolutely central. You descended from that unremarkable green door into a low-ceilinged cellar. The ceiling was low enough that tall women had to be careful. The room was not large. There was a bar. There was a dance floor. And there was the Gateways grind, a style of dancing that was intimate and close and slow, and that had become, over the years, the signature of this particular place. The grind was suggestive, sensual, unapologetically close. It was the kind of dancing that happened when women were dancing for themselves and for each other, not for a male gaze or with a male partner in mind. The Gateways was run, in its later years, by a woman named Gina Ware. And Gina Ware was, by all accounts, a particular kind of person. Pragmatic, tough, not interested in politics or ideology. She ran a bar. She wanted to keep it running. She understood that the bar's survival depended on maintaining a certain relationship with the authorities, not provoking them, not giving them reasons to come in and shut things down, staying under the radar as much as possible. The Gateways appears in film history in a way that is interesting and complicated. In 1968, a British film called The Killing of Sister George was released. It's a dark, often unflattering film about a lesbian relationship, set partly in a world of women's social clubs. And the actual Gateways Club was used as a filming location. About 80 of its members appeared as extras. The film was one of the first mainstream British productions to deal explicitly with lesbian life, which made it, by some measure, historically significant. But Gina Ware later expressed deep regret about the film. Looking back, she felt that it had not presented a positive view of lesbianism. It was a dark story, filled with manipulation and cruelty and ultimately tragedy. and its portrayal of the women who inhabited these spaces was not a sympathetic one. The representation had been highly anticipated and then had disappointed, had maybe even harmed, the community it depicted. It's a theme that runs through queer media history. The question of who gets to tell the story, and what kind of story gets told when the telling is done by outsiders. The gateways managed to stay out of trouble, mostly by staying quiet, by being the kind of place that didn't attract attention, that didn't make demands, that didn't put up flags or invite public scrutiny. Gina Ware was not looking for a fight. So when, in 1971, members of the Gay Liberation Front showed up outside the gateways to protest, she was not pleased. The Gay Liberation Front was one of the new organizations that had emerged in the wake of the Stonewall Uprising of 1969. It was energetic, confrontational, politically radical, committed to visibility rather than concealment. And it had opinions about places like the gateways, establishments that served the community but refused to politicize themselves, that provided refuge without demanding rights, that had built their survival on not making waves. Gina Ware's response was to call the police. It's a remarkable moment. The owner of one of the most important lesbian social spaces in London called the police on queer activists protesting outside her bar. And it makes a certain kind of sense if you understand her position and her priorities. She had built this place over decades by managing her relationship with authority very carefully. She was not going to let a group of young activists blow that up. But it also shows, with sharp clarity, the tension that was pulling the community apart in that era. The old school pragmatists and the new school activists were looking at the same reality and drawing completely different conclusions about what needed to be done. The pragmatists said, stay quiet, stay hidden, survive. The activists said, we've been surviving in hiding for long enough, and it's killing us, and we need something different. The world that the Gay Liberation Front was responding to had been shaped, profoundly, by an event in New York City in June of 1969. You know the name. Stonewall. The Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village was a bar. A gay bar, not specifically a lesbian bar, though women were certainly present and played important roles in what happened there. In the early morning hours of June 28th, 1969, police raided the bar. This was not unusual. Police raided gay bars regularly, and the patrons of Stonewall had experienced it before. But something was different that night. Instead of submitting to the raid with the resigned compliance that had become a grim habit, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn fought back. The uprising that followed lasted several nights. It was chaotic, and sometimes violent and historically disorganized. It was a riot after all, not a planned event. But its effects were enormous. Within months, the Gay Liberation Front had been founded. Within a year, the first gay pride marches were being organized. Within a few years, a national political movement had come into existence that had not existed before. For lesbian bars, Stonewall was both a catalyst and a complication. The post-Stonewall political energy transformed the context in which lesbian bars operated. It was no longer simply about survival, about keeping the lights on and the police at bay and the liquor license intact. There was now a broader conversation happening, a political framework in which the existence of queer spaces was understood as a form of resistance to a system that needed to be fundamentally changed. The bars were, in this framing, not just places to drink and dance. They were beachheads. They were evidence that the community existed, that it was organised, that it wasn't going away. But the gay liberation movement, for all its energy and importance, was not always attentive to the specific experiences of women. The gay male world and the lesbian world overlapped, but were not the same. And the political culture of the early liberation movement often reflected gay male concerns and priorities more than lesbian ones. Many women who were active in gay liberation organizations in the early 1970s eventually concluded that they needed to build something separate. Organizations and spaces that were specifically about women, specifically about lesbian experience, specifically about the intersections of homophobia and sexism. This gave rise to lesbian-feminism. And lesbian-feminism transformed the social world of the lesbian bar. At Maud's in San Francisco, the change was visible in something small but significant. A woman named Judy Grahn, a poet, a political activist, one of the important voices of lesbian feminist literature, introduced something to the bar. She brought in a book rack, a political book rack, stocked with feminist and lesbian feminist publications, with poetry and theory and manifestos. The book rack at Maud's was not a major political event in any conventional sense. It wasn't a rally or a march or a legislative victory, but it was a statement about what a bar could be, about what it could do beyond providing alcohol and a dance floor. It said, "This is a community space. This is a place where ideas matter. This is a place where we are not just escaping the world, but thinking about how to change it." Ricky Streicher, who ran Maud's, understood what this meant. Maud's pioneered the Gay Softball League, using sport, the organised pleasure of games and competition, as a way of building community cohesion and bringing women together outside the bar setting itself. The bar was becoming the centre of a social world that extended beyond its walls, that organised activity and connection in multiple registers, not just the consumption of alcohol in a dim room. Maud's closed in 1989. The closure was documented in a film called Last Call at Maud's, which captured the end of an era. The end, really, of the neighbourhood-based dive bar as the primary institution of lesbian community life. By 1989, the community that Maud's had served was changing. Women were, in many cases, more economically mobile than they had been. They were moving to suburbs. They were building lives that were organised less around a single neighbourhood bar and more around a wider range of social institutions. Sports teams, political organisations, businesses, social clubs. The bar had done its job. It had helped build a community robust enough to survive without it. But the closure hurt. It always hurts. The New York scene was developing in its own parallel ways. The Duchess was a women's bar in New York City that operated for years as one of the city's primary lesbian social spaces. Like Maud's, it sat at the intersection of multiple eras and multiple communities. And like Maud's, it was shaped by the tension between the older bar culture and the newer political movements. In New York, as in San Francisco and other major cities, the post-Stonewall years saw lesbian women who had been active in mixed gay liberation organizations gradually separating out, building their own spaces and organizations. The women's bar was, in this context, not just a social space, but a political statement, a declaration that women needed and deserved spaces that were specifically theirs. Women only, became a key concept in lesbian feminist politics of the 1970s. The argument was straightforward. Women had always had to negotiate the presence of men, always had to manage male expectations and male behaviour, always had to perform in relation to a male gaze. A space that was entirely women, where there were no men, where the social dynamics were not organised around men, where women could be with each other without reference to men at all, was not an act of exclusion, but an act of liberation. This was powerful, and it was contested. Then, as now, the question of who counts as a woman, who belongs in women-only spaces, was not always answered in ways that were kind or inclusive. The history of lesbian separatism in the 1970s includes some decisions and some rhetoric that, in retrospect, particularly regarding trans women, reflects the limitations and sometimes the failures of the movement. But the energy was real. The desire for spaces that were genuinely centered on women's experiences and women's desires and women's pleasures was real, and it was legitimate, and it drove the creation of a remarkable range of institutions during this period. And then came the 1980s, and with the 1980s came AIDS, which, though it primarily devastated the gay male community, reshaped the entire LGBTQ+ world in ways that are impossible to overstate. And in the middle of tragedy, something else was also happening in lesbian spaces. A shift toward pleasure. The era of lesbian chic in the late 1980s and 1990s. The moment when lesbian identity began to be visible in mainstream culture in new ways, when figures like K.D. Lang and Melissa Etheridge came out and were celebrated rather than destroyed. This was also an era of significant sexual and political energy within lesbian communities. In New York, a venue called the Clit Club emerged as an emblem of this energy. The Clit Club was, by any measure, a departure from the aesthetic of earlier lesbian bars. It was sex-positive, deliberately and explicitly. It featured go-go dancers. It used provocative imagery. It created an atmosphere that had more in common with the more overtly sexual world of gay male nightlife than with the political sobriety of the 1970s lesbian feminist scene. The Clit Club was, in its own way, a political act, a rejection of the idea that lesbian spaces had to be sanitized, or decorous, or focused only on uplift and consciousness raising. It said, pleasure is also political. Desire is also political. We get to have fun. We get to be sexual beings, in public, in community, in a space that belongs to us. Not everyone agreed. The sex-positive turn of the 1980s and 1990s was met with discomfort and sometimes fierce opposition from women who felt that it imported problematic dynamics from gay male culture, rather than building something authentically rooted in women's experience. The debates of this period were heated and sometimes unkind, and they touched on questions about pornography, about S&M, about gender and desire that were genuinely complicated and remained so. But the diversity of spaces that existed during this era is striking. At one end, you had venues that were explicitly erotic and sex-positive. At the other, you had spaces that were quiet and politically serious, focused on organising and community building. And in between, you had everything: neighbourhood bars, sports bars, coffee houses, bookstores that also functioned as social gathering places. The ecosystem was rich and varied in ways that, as we'll see, it would not always remain. Sisters in Philadelphia captures something specific about the complex history of lesbian bars in the late 20th and early 21st century. Sisters opened in 1996. The branding, sneakers to high heels, was deliberately inclusive. It was saying, you don't have to be any particular kind of lesbian to come here. Whether you're butch or femme, working class or professional, athletic or glamorous, you belong. The phrase was an attempt to bridge the class and aesthetic divisions that had fragmented the community to create a space that genuinely served a diverse population. And, for a while, it worked. Sisters became a gathering place for Philadelphia's lesbian community in a way that many venues from that era did not. It had longevity. It had regulars. It had the kind of accumulated history that makes a bar feel like an institution rather than just a business. But the late 2000s brought something that sisters had not fully anticipated. Several members of the staff transitioned. Several regular patrons transitioned. People who had been part of the sisters community as women began to live as men, and they brought their histories, their relationships, their established places in the social fabric of this bar with them. This created a genuinely difficult situation. Sisters had been a women's bar. That was its identity, its history, its reason for being. How did it accommodate people who had been part of that community, but who were now living as men? How did it think about its women-only policy in a world where the category of woman was being understood in more complicated and more expansive ways? These are not questions with easy answers. The people involved were not abstractions. They were regulars, staff members, friends. The question of whether to include them or ask them to leave was not an abstract political debate. It was a decision with real human consequences either way. Sisters struggled with this. Alongside these internal tensions, the economic pressures of gentrification were closing in. The Philadelphia neighborhood where Sisters was located was changing. Rents were rising. The working class and middle class lesbian community that had sustained the bar was being priced out of the surrounding neighborhood. Sisters closed in 2013. The landscape of the lesbian bar had been shrinking for some time before Sisters closed. But the pace of that shrinkage is remarkable and worth sitting with. In the 1980s, there were over 200 lesbian bars in the United States. 200 places. In cities across the country, from major metropolitan centers to mid-sized cities, to a few surprising smaller towns, where women could walk through a door and find their community. Today, the number is somewhere between 21 and 25, depending on how you count and when you're counting. That's a decline of roughly 90%. 90%. When you try to explain a decline of that magnitude, you need more than one cause. And indeed, the disappearance of the lesbian bar is the product of multiple forces converging over several decades. The first is gentrification. Gentrification describes what happens when the economic character of a neighborhood changes, when property values rise, when wealthier residents and businesses move in, when the existing community finds itself priced out of a place it built. Queer communities have a complicated relationship with gentrification. On one hand, LGBTQ plus people, particularly gay men, and, to a lesser extent, lesbian women, are often credited with having pioneered neighborhoods that later became valuable. The story goes, queer people moved into depressed urban neighborhoods, often because they were cheap, and because the existing residents were less likely to harass them, and they built businesses and community institutions, and generally made the neighborhood more livable and eventually more desirable. And then the real estate market moved in. The rents went up, and the very community that had built the neighborhood was priced out of it. This dynamic has affected lesbian bars across the country. The buildings that housed them, often in urban neighborhoods that were once affordable but have since been transformed, have been converted to luxury condos. Leases have not been renewed because the space is worth more as something else. A bar that has operated for decades in a building suddenly faces a landlord who has no interest in accommodating a low-margin drinking establishment when they can get 3 times the rent from a tech company or a trendy restaurant. The second force is economic. Women, on average, earn less than men. Lesbians, specifically, face what researchers sometimes call a wage penalty. They tend to out-earn straight women to a modest degree, but they earn less than gay men, and significantly less than straight men. The disposable income available to a lesbian bar's target clientele is, on average, lower than the disposable income available to a gay bar's target clientele. This matters in very practical ways. The margins on a bar are thin. You're depending on people spending money on drinks over the course of an evening. If your customers have less money to spend, your revenue is constrained in ways that make everything harder. Running a business on thin margins, without adequate capital, serving a clientele that has less disposable income than comparable businesses serving other groups. This is a recipe for fragility. The third force is digital displacement. Dating apps changed the social landscape for queer people in ways that are genuinely hard to fully measure. For much of the 20th century, the bar was, among other things, a place to meet potential partners. When apps created digital environments where people could find and connect with potential partners without leaving their homes, one of the practical functions of the bar was reduced. But something genuinely interesting has also emerged. Lesbian women, and queer women more broadly, are filling stadiums. The PWHL, the Professional Women's Hockey League, has found overwhelmingly queer audiences in many of its markets. The WNBA has long been a gathering place for lesbian and queer fans. The NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League, has similarly become a space where queer women congregate in enormous numbers. These stadium communities represent a shift in where and how community happens. But a stadium is not the same as a bar. A stadium is wonderful, and the experience of being in one with thousands of people who share your identity is genuinely powerful. But you can't have the conversation you need to have at a stadium. You can't meet someone for the first time and spend 3 hours getting to know them. You can't find the community you need when you're 18 and you've just moved to a new city and you don't know anyone and you're scared. You can't be a regular, a known face, someone who walks in and is greeted by name. The bar provides things that no stadium can, and those things matter. The Lesbian Bar Project. In 2020, during the pandemic, lesbian bars were already rare, already in that diminished state we've been describing. But the pandemic threatened to finish the job. Bars closed, reopened, closed again. Revenue dropped to 0, and then crept back up, and then dropped again. The spaces that were already fragile became desperately vulnerable. A filmmaker named Erica Rose and her producing partner, Elena Street, launched the Lesbian Bar Project as a documentary series and advocacy initiative. Their goal was both to document the remaining lesbian bars in America, to tell their stories, to make visible what was disappearing, and to actively help save them through crowdfunding and awareness campaigns. The crowdfunding effort raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. The money went directly to the bars to help with rent, with equipment, with whatever was most urgent for a given establishment. But maybe as important as the money was the attention. The Lesbian Bar Project told stories. It made visible a history that had been largely invisible, told the world that these places existed and mattered and were worth saving. The response was remarkable. The campaign attracted attention far beyond the immediate community of lesbian bar patrons. Straight allies donated. People who had never been to a lesbian bar donated. The story of these spaces, their history, their importance, their precarity, turned out to resonate with a much wider audience than might have been expected. The concept of flinter is worth spending a few minutes with, because it represents one of the most significant current conversations within the community about what these spaces are and what they should be. Flinter stands for female, lesbian, intersex, non-binary, trans, agender. It's an umbrella concept that emerged primarily from European queer and feminist communities and has been adopted in various contexts around the world. Its use in the context of queer social spaces represents an attempt to be inclusive, to describe a space that is welcoming to a broad range of gender identities and experiences while remaining specifically oriented toward people who are not cisgender men. Many bars and venues that might once have described themselves as lesbian bars or women's bars have shifted to using language like this. They're trying to create spaces that include trans women, non-binary people, intersex people, and others who don't fit into the binary categories that older formulations relied on. This shift is welcome to many people. It reflects real changes in how the community understands gender and identity, real expansions of who belongs and who is included. But it also generates real grief for some women. There are lesbians, women who are attracted specifically to other women, who built their community in spaces that were specifically lesbian, who experience the shift to flinter framing as a kind of erasure, not because they oppose trans rights or non-binary identities, but because they feel that the specific history of lesbian women, of dykes, of the culture that was built in bars like Maud's and the Gateways and Sisters, is being dissolved into a broader category that doesn't quite capture it. Aching for dyke-focused spaces. That phrase captures this feeling precisely. The ache is real. The culture that existed in those spaces was specific, was irreplaceable in certain ways, was the product of a particular history and a particular community. The shift toward flinter spaces represents genuine moral progress in the recognition of trans and non-binary people. The grief for dyke-specific culture represents a genuine loss. Both things are true simultaneously, and the people navigating this tension deserve to have it acknowledged honestly. The lesbian bar has always been a site of negotiation. Negotiation with the state. Negotiation with mainstream culture. Negotiation among different factions and identities within the community itself. The current negotiation over who belongs and what label to use is part of a longer tradition of self-definition and struggle. These spaces were never perfect. They were shaped by the prejudices and limitations of their time and place. Many of them were predominantly or exclusively white, reflecting the racism that structured American social life. Many of them were shaped by class hierarchies that divided the community. They were places where real human beings, with real flaws, spent time together, which means they were places where hurt happened, where exclusion happened, where people were sometimes made to feel that they didn't belong. The history of the lesbian bar is not a simple story of utopia lost. It's a more complicated story about imperfect spaces that nonetheless provided something irreplaceable to many, many women. The fact that these spaces were flawed doesn't diminish the loss. It makes it more human. The women who built the early lesbian bars, who pushed open those unremarkable doors, who set up those dimly lit rooms, who loaded the jukeboxes and got behind the bar and figured out how to stay one step ahead of the liquor board. They were not trying to make history. They were trying to make a place to go on a Friday night. They were trying to solve a practical problem. How do you live fully as yourself in a world that doesn't want you to? Their solutions were imperfect. They were human beings, limited by their time and their context, making decisions under enormous pressure. Some of those decisions look, from here, like mistakes. Some of them reflected prejudices that we've spent decades working to undo. But they built something. From nothing, out of necessity, they built a world. The apartment party became the dive bar. The dive bar became the institution. The institution became the community centre, the political hub, the chosen family gathering place. The bar produced the softball league, the poetry book rack, the awareness of a shared history. The community that the bar incubated eventually produced the political organisation, the legal reform, the cultural visibility, the changed world. It all traces back to a door, an unremarkable door, on an unremarkable street, behind which something remarkable is always happening. There's a particular kind of gratitude that comes from understanding history, not the gratitude of nostalgia, of wishing you'd been there, of romanticising the past, but the gratitude of recognition, of understanding that the life you have, the freedoms you have, the community you belong to, was built by people who came before you and who worked incredibly hard to build it, often without any assurance that it would last. The bars are closing. The numbers tell a stark story, from over 200 to 20-something. A loss so large it's almost hard to absorb. But the need hasn't gone away. The need for recognition, for community, for a place that belongs to you. That's as alive as it ever was. The form keeps changing. The need doesn't. I want to leave you with the image of a door. You can choose which one. The green door at 239 Kings Road, or the door to Maud's, or the door to Peg's Place, or the door to Sisters, or any of the dozens of other doors that have, over the decades, opened into spaces where women could be themselves. Behind that door, music is playing, maybe something from a jukebox, slow and a little scratchy. Maybe a DJ spinning something that makes the room move. Maybe just the sound of women's voices, talking, laughing, telling each other the stories that make up a life. The light is low, the air is warm. Someone is getting up to dance, and someone else is watching with a small smile, and the bartender is wiping down the bar. And in the corner booth, there's a conversation happening that might change somebody's life. It's just a bar. It's just a room with a door and some stools and a jukebox and people who needed somewhere to go. And it was everything. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, exploring this history. If you learned something tonight, if some part of this story moved you or surprised you, or gave you something to think about, I hope you'll carry it with you. The full source list for tonight's episode is in the description below, as always. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does make a difference, and it helps these stories reach the people who need them. And I'll be back tomorrow night with another episode. For now, though, let the music play a little longer. Let the room stay warm for a moment more. Close your eyes. You don't have to go anywhere. Rest.